Welcome to Insatslinguicatl. This is a podcast about poetic thinking, where we share with you a different perspective of the social world. Every episode, we take a topic or a concept, and we use the lens of philosophy, psychology, mythology, and art to analyze the wonderful horrors of the modern world. My name is Andrea Martinez.
My name is Andrea Celeste. This is our third and last installment on the topic of death. In the last two episodes, we discussed the scatological elements in our society, the thanatic drive, suicide, and the way we face death as individuals. Today, we will explore the death of others and the different ways we have of confronting it.
I'm going to start with a quote by John Didion. John Didion is a writer, an American writer. One of her most famous books in the 70s was Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And more recently, she regained fame or became quite visible again because she wrote two books. One is The Year of Magical Thinking, which is the one that I'm quoting, and then Blue Nights. And these two books are kind of like a reporting on the process of grief. The Year of Magical Thinking is about the death of her husband, John Donne, another writer. And basically, and the next one, Blue Nights, is about the death of her daughter, Quintana Dunn. And so there was a documentary made about her on Netflix that is called The Center Will Not Hold, where she explores, well, she talks about her books, these two books, and again, kind of talks about her process of grieving. So I'm just going to read a small part from that, from The Year of Magical Thinking. And here it goes. Grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it. We anticipate, we know, that someone close to us could die, but we do not look beyond the few days or weeks that immediately follow such an imagined death. We imagine that the moment to most severely test us will be the funeral, after which this hypothetical healing will take place. We anticipate needing to steel ourselves for a moment. Will I be able to greet people? Will I be able to leave the scene? Will I be able even to get dressed that day? We have no way of knowing that this will not be the issue. We have no way of knowing that the funeral itself will be anodyne, a kind of narcotic regression in which we are wrapped in the care of others and the gravity and meaning of the occasion. Nor can we know ahead of the fact, and here lies the heart of the difference between grief as we imagine it and grief as it is. The unending absence that follows, the void, the very opposite of meaning, the relentless succession of moments during which we will confront the experience of meaninglessness itself. And so this quote is kind of what allows us to open the topic and to put it on the table today, because it encapsulates everything that we're talking about and that we've talked about also already in terms of meaninglessness and the creation of meaning and today of the absence of the other and how we confront the death of somebody close to us in particular.
Yeah, and how that affects us, how that, gets in the way of our lives and can actually, in the worst case scenario, also mean the death of ourselves.
And also symbolically, the part that of us that dies when someone that we love dies, and that so often we kind of avoid the process of grieving, particularly in, I feel, Western culture. Like as Joan Didion says, we focus on the funeral, we focus on the tragedy, but we do not really know, and we don't, like she says, we don't really anticipate what the grief that follows feels like
in the daily basis, which in a way also that's the same for most of our human rights. Like the wedding is the same. The wedding rite will not equal what the daily life will be, and one rarely, or not one rarely, but that's one of the wise tales that the grandmother will give you. And from the quote of John Didion, the part of narcotic regression reminds me of Demeter, the goddess, which I think I have name dropped her in almost every episode. But yet again, her myth and her rite comes to mind because she is one of these archetypical mourners. I mean, they also serve archetypically as other images. For instance, she's also a mother, but she is also from the canon of mourners. Demeter, Antigone, Electra, the wife of Phocion, Hecuba, all the Trojan women. But I will start with Demeter because she, as John Didion, mourns her daughter. So part of the process of grieving from her, which for her or for her like dramatic arc means transforming herself from a fury to a benign goddess again for humanity. I will
Mhm.
explain this. She is infuriated because her daughter has been kidnapped by the god of death. So this means the girl is dead. This is why also Persephone's name in the rite in the Eleusinian mysteries is also just called the girl, because she represents all girls that have died before their time. Now, what is also interesting, I won't go very much into it, but it is interesting that death rite, that image of the bride is linked, as she can be wedding the death, she can be wedding death, or she can be wedding an actual husband. So
Mhm.
it's a dual image to begin
Mhm.
with. Anyway, she is infuriatingly grieving the loss of her daughter. That the fact that no divine creature will tell her where she is. She enters a castle where she is received with milk and honey, which is a sort of narcotic beverage for furies, or the way that you calm furies down. So kind of the way that humanity unlocked the heart of this goddess that was infuriated and that had decided that nothing was going to grow on earth was by taking care of her. And by taking care of her, they gave her a baby. So to take care of her, they gave her something else to take care of.
Mhm.
And they give her a baby, the baby of the family, of this royal family. She nourishes this baby. And as she nourishes this baby, she decides that humanity has no fault in this, in her loss, and that instead of her vengeance falling upon us as well, she's going to teach us the mystery of the seed, and how we can learn this, how we can grow well, food and actually ourselves as well. Because in these mysteries that we have cited in a couple of other episodes, you are supposed to see the dead girl, to see Persephone, to see her is to see whatever it is you have lost as well, and to cope with that loss, and to come out of the initiatory mysteries as learning how to cope with the loss, that there is no lost paradise, which
This
is
myth, sorry, this myth of Demeter that you mentioned reminds me of a movie that recently came out. I don't know if you've watched it, Pieces of a Woman.
no.
Um, I can't remember the name of the actress, but she's also in The Crown. Vanessa Kirby. Vanessa Kirby. She plays this a mother to be, a pregnant woman, and her husband in or her partner in the movie is Shia LaBeouf, in famous Shia LaBeouf. A brilliant performances by both actors, and the whole story is the death of the baby. The baby is born alive and dies within minutes. And like you mentioned in the case of the Greek myth, and also that's something that is kind of like a given in our culture, is that the death of a child is anti-natural. It's so traumatic because it goes against what you would expect. And so I thought of this movie because you said, well, she drinks milk and honey, and that's meant to calm her fury, and she comes to this place of like kind of like acceptance. And so in the movie, Vanessa Kirby, they file a lawsuit against the midwife, right? And so that's the fury, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
and the whole process of the movie is like, partially is like finding evidence that like other women have suffered at the hands of this midwife or whatever. And when she goes to the court when the trial is on, before she goes, she picks up a photo that she had never seen, that was taken of the day of the birth of the child, when she's hugging her child. And from then on, she decides that she's going to not press charges anymore. She's not going to continue with the trial. And she goes into the court and says, in the end, this was not the midwife's fault. This just happened because shit happens. And
Yeah,
the baby died.
and in that sense, what we could also say is that, well, she sort of matured the process, because in fact this is what happens. Even though the death of a child is terrible, is still a possibility.
Mhm.
And in that sense, well, for the in the development of the psyche, for the psychoanalytic theory, for instance, we could say that we come to maturity by understanding that we gain by losing, we gain by loss constantly, which is what we gain. Well, something. It depends, and it's for us to build also this, to find this gain and to acknowledge this gain, or
Well, I mean, also like if you see the way that this, well, not necessarily the death of the child, but how death is portrayed even in Disney movies, right? Like, the not what is more like what is part of development is death of the parents, right? So we see this in Bambi when the
yeah.
mother gets shot, and we see this in The Lion King, which, what's the name of the father? Um,
Mufasa.
Mufasa. Oh, who's the bad one? Scar.
Scar.
Scar. And so, yeah, so Mufasa dies, and like this is kind of like a threshold, right, for the main characters, both for Bambi and for
Yeah, and like
Simba.
and like the Skywalkers, for instance, in the myth of Star Wars, um, both heroes, or hero and heroine, which are twins, have to deal with the grieving, also the loss of the ideas they have of, well, in the case of Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker. So in the process of learning that Darth Vader is his father, he has to kill this symbolic image he had made for himself of Anakin, and grieve the fact that that Anakin is alive in Darth Vader, and that's what happened. And in that sense, Darth Vader killed Anakin Skywalker, and also he has to lose his love interest, which turns out to be his twin sister Leia.
Mhm.
And she also has, well, the process of this same, well, not same, but an analog process of loss. And well, Demeter is not, as I mentioned before, the only archetypical image of the mourner. We also have Antigone, of course, but I would like to mention
Which
Hecuba.
hopefully we will talk about in one episode about Antigone and the Uncanny, which is one of my favorite
Oh
myths in
yes,
the whole world.
let's. Antigone is a favorite of the West, indeed. Anyway, Hecuba, which is, well, the Trojan queen that's been defeated. Hecuba has this terrible myth where in one day she has to sacrifice her daughter, which is the like the mirror sacrifice, or the mirroring sacrifice in the Iliad myth. It starts with Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, and it ends with Polyxena, which is this Trojan princess, the daughter of Hecuba, which, well, I won't go into the details, but she has to accept the fact that she will be sacrificed to the ghost of Achilles. And when she's going to bathe the dead corpse of her child, she also, the sea washes out the corpse of her last living son, or what she thought what was her son that was still alive. And she finds out that no, that the host that had received this child killed him in order to favor the Greeks. So this double grief makes her, well, she's called a bitch. In the end of the play, she's called this sea bitch. She becomes a sea bitch out of this powerful vengeance. But she convinces the Greeks that she has the authority to kill this host, because she is now basically a Greek, because she has been taken by the Greeks and the Greeks don't allow this to pass. The host cannot kill their host, their guest, I mean. So I don't care if you killed my daughter and I hate you for it. You will give me this. You will give me this. So in that sense, also, this is why she becomes a sea bitch and she doesn't become a more favorous god to humanity, for instance, because what she gains continues to be vengeance. And this is something that Western civilization is going to make a frowny face constantly. We shan't act vengefully upon the other. That is one of our basic principles in terms of our civilization. We don't get to be furies, only furies get to be furies, and even them are not, they don't get out of the inferno and see the light.
And that's kind of what, like, that continues to be, and that Didion also mentions in her book of, there is this assumption that the process of grief will will end in healing, right? That you'll feel terrible for a little bit, and you'll go through different stages of grief, and then eventually you'll heal. And John Didion mentions an example when she arrives with the ambulance, with her husband in the ambulance, and he's pronounced death in the hospital. And as she goes to recognize, when you have to recognize the body, the person in charge, like, I guess she the way Joan reacts is very mechanic and very gets like doesn't break down, or doesn't, she just kind of signs papers and,
Like Mandy Moore in This Is Us.
okay, I haven't watched this us. What does she do?
This very mechanical, very like out of out of herself, kind of just
Yeah.
reacting in a very mechanical, automatic way.
And so when the doctor comes and asks Joan something about the next steps, the other person that was with her, with recognizing the body, says, "Oh no, she's fine. She's a cool customer." And Joan Didion takes this phrase and says, "Well, what does it obviously?" And then writes, doesn't say anything at the time, but writes about it, saying, "Well, what does it mean not to be a good, cool customer? Does it mean to break down? Does it mean to not accept the death? Does it mean, what does it mean? Why do we expect? Why do we praise the coolness, right?" And of
Oh,
course,
this has a lot to do with why, for instance, the Greeks forbade um, mourning in public, because it's not cool. It's not cool. Mourning, the barbaric mourning rites are feminizing. That's one of their traits, and by feminizing they mean it's too much. There's too
yeah.
much feeling.
Even in, like, if you think of popular culture, I'm thinking about an episode in particular of Sex and the City, which now it's quite old,
And
um,
canceled.
and canceled, where Miranda is like talking to her boss, and they're arguing about something, and Miranda, who is like the more masculine, like, you know, power woman, power lawyer, and all this, and she says, "And I just want to remind you that when my mother died, I was back in the office on Monday, and her mother dies
Oh
like on the
yeah.
Friday." And so this, like, this speaks of like what, you know, American culture, and like, you know, of our view of, okay, well, you're so good, you're so cool, you're so professional that your mom died and you were back in the office on Monday.
Yeah, actually, that's what Hecuba will not do. She will become a sea bitch instead of, being in the office, which means being a slave to the Greeks on Monday. But this is like a positive trait for us Westerners, which is in terms of this phallocratic masculine patriarchy, which is also interesting. This that uh, well, the cradle of our civilization being the Greeks in many ways, as we've said constantly, genderizes such human processes like mourning. This is why most of I only have one example that is male, for instance, and we can discuss how masculine this example is because he is the archetypical image of the poet. It's Orpheus. So and being a poet means that he has this melancholic trait as well, which feminizes him a tad. So mourning is still related to this feminine
To emotion, yes.
symbolic, yes, this feminine symbol that the West has built. So yeah, and for instance, in the myth of Orpheus, just to establish a relationship with mourning and music as well, or mourning and poet and mourning and art, what Orpheus gains by the inevitable loss of Eurydice is music, because his grief is turned by the act of sublimation, psychoanalysis would say, into art.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, he even makes the Furies cry, for instance. That's how he negotiates with the gods of the underworld. It's because his music of grief is so beautiful that he must have her back.
All right.
But then in the end, he doesn't have her back, and maybe because the music was so good. Maybe that's why he looked back. I always say that in terms of how the romantics, the romantic poets, white male romantic poets, best fortune would be always that they would lose their love. If they lost their love, then their poetry would be forever sealed by this, well, by
By
the eternal,
tragedy.
by the eternal feminine, which is this woman that will never change, that was like, well, like Eurydice will always be to Orpheus. And mythically, uh, and I would invite our audience to, if they know another image, a male image that has this process of grief, that doesn't battle with grief, because Hercules, what he does is that he goes mad. He does not deal with grief. He's not a mourner. That's the difference. These archetypes, these mythical characters that I exemplified, are mourners. They do grief their loss. They don't combat it.
And talking about the process of grief, I'm just going to fast forward to the 20th century and talk about the woman, unsurprisingly, who establishes the first model of grieving for the dead, like a psychological. And she's the founder of thanatology, right, which is the study of death. Not the study of death, but like in particular, what thanatology does is that it prepares both the person in terminally ill or that is going to face death, but also the relatives before and after the death. It prepares them for grieving, and it kind of offers emotional, psychological support. So she's the founder, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Um, One of her most famous books is The Death and Dying, the Dead and Dying, and the one that I'm quoting today is called On Grief and Grieving, which she wrote, which David Kessler is one of her last books. And I bring her up because she's very important in terms of like when we talk about the grieving process in the West, she always comes up. And the stages of grief, I'm just going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you why they're criticized, are first denial, which if you think about this mechanic, kind of like when you're told somebody's dead, oftentimes you just kind of go through the motions and there is no emotional response after later. And then there's anger, which is the fury that we talked about. Then there's bargaining, which you are kind of negotiating the loss. Then depression, uh, which is of course sadness, melancholia, and then acceptance. So um I mean, she talks a lot, of course the examples that she gives are when somebody's chronically ill and terminally ill, like cancer, but also sudden deaths. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, one of the things that, like, I've been reading her books for many, many years now, I think decades, and she does believe that people have a sense that they will die. And this is also in John Didion's, that there is like an unconscious awareness that it's yeah, an unconscious awareness that the end is coming. And I mean, I find that quite magical, in terms.
Well, but biology sort of also says that, like the cell has kind of a programmed auto destruction program. And well, some biologists argue if the cell knows or not, but even if it knows or if it doesn't know, the program exists.
Right. Yeah, like I mean, in the death and dying, there are examples of like sudden deaths, like car accidents, or like she
Mm.
cites like people in some way giving signs. Now, I will always
Oh, I
question.
understand. I understand. Like what my father says about his dead brother, for instance, which is like he looks back and he says, I can tell now that his dying didn't come out of nowhere, even if it came out of nowhere, something like this.
Yeah, like that you have like like an unconscious feeling. So for example, John Donne, it's month before he dies, says to John Didion, let's go to Paris. And then John Didion says, oh, why do we want to go to Paris? I don't want to go to Paris, and like that. And he says, well, this I don't know if she says this might or this will be my last trip to Paris. And then she takes it as blackmail, emotional blackmail, but then it was.
Yeah.
So now, if you think about it retrospectively, I'm very skeptical about these things because I have like a very positivistic upbringing that Andrea always criticizes. So I'm always like, well, retrospectively, you can make these things fit into your,
Yeah.
into what you want it to be. Like, so yes, maybe he did have an unconscious awareness or whatnot. But books in like John Didion, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and other sources cite these examples that people kind of have like they
A
show
feeling.
signs,
Uh-huh.
that the end is coming. But anyway, I'm just going to quickly go back to the criticism of the stages of grief. So I mean, these are like mainstream, widely used and accepted. The criticism is, well, first, that they don't happen in that order necessarily, that you might have,
Mhm.
first anger, then acceptance, or then depression. And second, the other criticism is that, well, like if you say stages, that sounds quite passive. And like in the West, we don't like the word passive.
Oh,
So
yeah.
now they're called tasks because you have to actively engage with them, which I am
Oh.
more into the passive
I
argument.
am more into the passive. Yes, I am more barbaric in that sense.
So like, yeah, when I read the criticism, I was like, tasks, like
Yeah. I
how,
don't
like,
like tasks for
that sounds
to
very like
begin with.
capitalist, like, like this is what you have
Yeah,
to
like
do
you're not being
list.
productive enough
Yeah.
in your grief. How can you be productive in your grief? Come on.
Yeah. And I mean, in this sense, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, there is a vast cultural differences between how the West um, processes death and how the East does. So there was a study that I was looking at for the podcast that looked into the differences between Japanese widows and American widows. And two of the key differences are like American widows first show a lot more emotion within a short period of time after the death. So for the first 2 months, let's say, for
They're
example,
all in.
they're all in, and Japanese widows don't really show that much emotion. There is no big change, and this also has to do with the idea that the death are not really gone in for example Shintoism and well Buddhism has also a very different outlook on death, right? Is like a part of the wheel. And so
Yeah.
and so the Japanese women have less changes in their habits, but they are a lot less likely to remarry, whereas
But
the
the
American widows
Americans, yeah.
are a lot more likely to remarry.
Actually, it's a task.
Yeah, it's like
In
I'm over
some
it. I've overcome.
yeah,
I can love again.
in some spheres, I would say, I would dare say, of of some Western spheres, not just America, that's the deal. Like, you're over it, you just get over it, and then and the way you get over it is you get married. And that's well, again, the character of that Mandy Moore plays in this hit series called This Is Us, which is also This Is USA, called Rebecca Pearson. She is a mourner.
Hmm.
Like, the whole thing revolving her character, for instance, has to do with this. And actually, all of them, and how they take in this piece that died, which is the father. So
Hmm.
it's very patriarchal in many ways, that series. And because it also, well, the gender roles fall in the perfect order.
Hmm.
Again, this the name of the series can be also a play of words. This is the United States,
Yeah.
this is us. And well, it's, I mean, yes, who wouldn't mourn Jack Pearson? I mean, when you see that series, that man is perfect. I mean,
Hmm.
so he must be mourned. Now, that's interesting, because what I just said is that he must be mourned, but because now we are very we do moralize such subjects as death, for instance, and grieving, which has to do with if the death was is or isn't worthy of our grieving, for instance.
Yeah. I
And
mean, this has
in
to do. Sorry, it has to do with the title of our episode. This kind of um expectation of the person who died was always great, right? Do not speak ill of the dead. But also, and this is like a criticism that I have of modern left wing woke people, is like the normal way when we refer to the dead is like rest in peace, right? So because peace, like I mean it's obvious, right? You're dead, you don't no longer have to deal with all this crap.
yeah,
um
you're
uh,
finally at peace.
you're finally at peace. And now when we have the like the likes of like important figures or victims, right? Like I'm just thinking in particular of like George Floyd and we no longer say rest in peace, but rest in power, which again is very Western,
Yeah.
right? It's like you're going to be powerful in your death. And like it I think obviously there's like the message that they wanted to convey is that of like strength and solidarity and all these things, but like it really doesn't make much sense to me to say rest in power.
No, but also, like, well, the queen's husband just died, prince of I don't know what. I don't know
Duke
this
of
because
Edinburgh. I just know
I don't
because I
really
watched The Crown
care.
because I love Olivia Colman.
Okay, what? Oh, I love Olivia Colman. But the death of this duke, was also read by this political sector as, okay, people get over it. Like, we are done with your archaic forms, monarchy. And I agree. I agree. I am so
Well,
done with monarchy in many ways. In many ways, I'm done with monarchy, but that doesn't mean that the dude didn't die
right.
and that
Well,
the
no, the
dude was.
BBC received like thousands of complaints that weekend because the BBC stopped all their regular schedule. They stopped everything, right? So BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Three, BBC Four, like it was like we're just watching all the funeral together. Like they the BBC is like a news major institution, and they just stopped. And so the
They
British
are a monarchy.
yeah. Well, no, it just shows, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah, that's what it means. Like, that's what it means that the UK is the United Kingdom still.
yes.
That's what it means, that the BBC will go to blacks and make us all watch the funeral together. And well, I mean, I don't live there, so I don't have to deal with that. So whoever doesn't enjoy this, well, work for the monarchy to be abolished. But still, even if the monarchy is abolished, that doesn't mean that that dude didn't deserve a funeral right. That's part of the deal that is set in Antigone, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Antigone finds it like it's the clash between the two laws, right? The law of man and the law of the gods. And the law of the gods means that death is not your own, that you can't own the death of the other. And once the other is dead, then the identity is lost. And now he is the dead. And now actually the dead speaks more to me, the living in general, not because of what the dead was, but because it is dead. He or she is dead now. So the dead and the relationship with the dead body has to spring, according to Antigone, more to the fact that we die, not of what he did.
Yeah.
That is why
The,
it's linked with a superior law and a superior ethic.
the importance of the right. And I just to present a contrast of this, I'm just going to talk a little bit about go back to Taoism in China. And Taoism, um, as a religion, was very critical of the Confucian ethics. So, and why is this important? According to Confucius, the funeral and the process of mourning is extremely important. And this has to do with the value of ritual propriety, which is li in Chinese.
Okay.
And so for Confucius, I think it's 3 years of mourning for mourning of a father, and there are like certain
Specific rules, no?
specific rules,
To
specific colors, how long, who dresses, how, and Taoism, and particularly in the Chuangzi, there is a very harsh critique of both, this kind of rigid expectations and rules, and also an alternative process of grieving. So I'm going to give two examples. Number one is when Chuangzi's wife died, and his friend sees him, his friend Huetze, and when he sees Chuangzi is like drumming and singing, and Huetze says, "What are you doing? You're drumming and singing. You had children with her. Like, what's wrong with you?" So he says, "Nothing is wrong. Basically, nothing's wrong with me. Her energy has changed. She had life at some point, and now there's been another change, and she's dead." And he says, "These changes are to each other as a procession of the four seasons, right? She was going to sleep quietly in a giant bedroom, while I, in turn, was wailing and weeping. I took this to show I was incompetent with respect to fate, so I stopped." So he stops crying because you need to accept that this is
the
the
stage,
this is the path, this is the Tao, this is
yeah,
the way of the way of
of the
things.
spirit.
And so that's the first one about grieving, which of course, especially to us Mexicans, right? Like, you're like, what? He did what?
What? Like
uh,
you bring out the dead to eat still. Like they like in some places in Mexico still they dig them up and they sit them in the table. 21st century.
yeah,
Whatever it is they can find, a hand, the head, whatever, and they will. And yes, so
yeah.
you can't say that to Mexicans. Not, or not all, not all.
So the other example is Zigong, who was like a Confucius disciple, sees these four men, and they're singing, and they're not performing the funeral rites as they should be in the Confucian way. And he asks them, "May I be so bold as to ask what sort of ritual is this? Singing in the very presence of a corpse." And these two friends ask him back, "What does this man know of the meaning of ritual?" So it's a questioning of, what is it like of the
What is the proper way of grieving?
exactly.
And these Confucian laws on the rights of the dead, they well, they have an analog in the West, a strong analog in the West. For instance, in Albania, I believe, if I don't remember, if it's, I think it's 1939, the year that they changed their oral laws. They only had oral law, they didn't have a written law.
Mhm.
So in that way, their law was very similar to the an eye for an eye law. Actually, the law of vengeance um, was a present law until 1939, for instance, which was linked to a very specific way of mourning, which is that the mourners that which you pay. For instance, we also have this tradition in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, that you pay the plañideras, the mourners, the weepers.
Mhm.
Uh, and in Albania, it's called to cry according to law.
Mhm.
Like that's the law. You must cry the dead, because the dead is beyond our reach. And well, what we have already said. What I would like to put as a counterpart, just as in China you have the Confucius and the Tao, or the Confucian way and the Taoistic way. In the West, it's, well, we will find this in the beginnings of the Greek tragedy, for instance, and just the city state of Athens, where certain type of grieving is forbidden.
Mhm.
A certain type of grieving that is associated with the feminine, again, like with this sea bitch of Hecuba that will scar her cheeks with her own hands and tear out their hairs and just wail out. This wailing, this public wailing, was considered barbaric, which means from the other law, not the law of Athens, and was prohibited, and it was supplanted by, or superseded by, the um, the discourse that one gives the dying, the epitaph.
Mhm.
It was, how do you say this? Bueno, the epitaph. Hasta ahí me quedo. Um, and in that sense, for instance, Antigone, well, we don't see these feminine traits in her representation of mourning. She just covers the body, but she does not engage in this other wailing, uh, wailing form that is considered feminine and barbaric. I only say this because it is, well, in the most modern readings of Antigone, that Antigone is not a barbaric heroine. She's a complete masculine patriarch figure.
And just to comment on this, just sorry, you're talking about the wailing and the barbaric and the feminine. If you like, one of the things that I found interesting when I'm like I did a lot of reading about murders in Mexico and killing of women last year, and when women are described, especially the mothers, when the mothers are described as facing the death of their daughters, they are often described in their wailing is often described as bestial, as animal. Like it's
Yes.
which I think it's partially why we think of it not just as feminine, but as inappropriate, because it brings us closer to the animalistic kind of way of being. And I mean, this also, of course, has to do with the
But which is
patriarchy.
which is in origin related to to the feminine body.
Exactly.
That is the principal trait that separates that thought for the most patriarchal thought of Western culture, which are the Greeks. And to this point, I would like to bring to the table the enemy music of Orpheus. You know, for the Greeks, there's not only Orphic music or the music of Orpheus, but the music of the sirens.
Mm-hmm.
And the music of the sirens is also, it has a very black spot on itself, and it's the spot of the miasma of being feminine. Because, and the sirens, well, for the Greeks, they are half bird, half human, half women, have
Mm-hmm.
women body. They have breasts, and they're like the goddess from the breasts to the head, but the rest of their body is bird like. This is important because it's precisely linked to the voice of the birds, because the birds imitate. The birds have this quality that they a mimetic quality, and you can, if you whistle to the birds, you can have a conversation with birds. If you imitate their whistle, their tweeting, they will respond. And that mimetic quality is also linked to the Greeks, to the feminine. This is also why Plato sees in the process of acting of the actor as something that can be problematic to civilization, because he fears that what we see in the poetic form of tragedy, what we see is this representation of an of a wailing thing, because tragedy has to do with grief and has to do with someone that is being mourned, and it has to do with the barbaric as well, with accepting and acknowledging this barbaric base, without we can't come we without which we wouldn't have imagined the city state of Athens.
Mm-hmm.
This is why theater holds this very ambivalent thing for Western culture. And that's why philosophy sometimes praises it and sometimes wants to destroy it. It has to do with this mimetic quality.
Mm-hmm.
Plato says mimesis, which is the Greek word for imitation, which is to represent the other that is not there, which is the dead or the wailer, etc., uh, is very feminine. It's beast like. Birds do it, sirens do it.
Mm-hmm.
We mustn't do it. We must, they, the whalers, the grief contaminates the body.
Yeah.
We can't be ourselves. This is why it is such a huge difference, the music from the sirens and the music from Orpheus, because the sirens, the music comes from their mouth, and Orphic music has to do with the lyre, and which is the string music,
Yeah.
and you know, the whole, which allows you to sit straight and talk, speak,
Mm-hmm.
you know, not go all around like a crazy person, drumming and wailing yourself out of your grief.
Right.
You know, that's what Pascal Quignard says in his book Butes. There is where I'm extracting all of this information in terms of this, of the combat between these two musics and how they have to do with the process of grief, and
Okay.
how grief goes way back where we were beasts. We stopped being
Yeah.
beasts by being beasts
And
at
how
the
like
same
also
time.
the rites that are built around that, the funeral, the wake, the burial, there it's all like it's meant to help you through the grief, but also takes away this like the void, right? The void of the absence, and then these bestial barbaric reactions that we could potentially have. And in that way, just to use one more comparative example, and now in terms of similarities more so than differences between Japan and the West in terms of these rites, is that just like for example in Mexico we have el novenario. El novenario means that after the person dies, you pray every day for 9 days, and you
Well,
pray
that's
the
a
rosary.
Catholic rite.
Yeah,
It's a Catholic rite,
yeah,
not
but
not
it
just
doesn't.
Mexican.
But for example, Ireland is Catholic, and nobody does the novenario here.
Oh, okay.
For example, yeah. So like Mexico, I think is more ritualistic in these ways, and
Yes.
also, you have to have the mass after the 1 year, and like for example, in my family, they do every month for the first year, and then every year. And this is similar to, yeah, but my family is like proper Mexican Catholic. God bless them. And in Japan, it's similar. And they have memorial services 7 days after the death. Then on the 49th day, the urn is interred. So that's the with the ashes. And then uh, w- every year, then every 3 years, then every 5 years, and every 7 years, and every 13 years there has to be a ceremony. So it's very specific as well, right? And actually, one of the interesting things about Japan that I didn't know is that during the after the cremation, the family picks up the bones. You
Oh,
actually have, and that's
yeah.
the first was the similarities, right? But one of the differences that I find quite interesting is that in the West we're quite removed from the dead. We don't want to see what happens after they're cremated. We don't really want to interact too much with the corpse. But for example, in Japan, the family picks up the bones starting from the feet and moving up to the skull. So I thought that was quite interesting because it really puts a tactile aspect to the confrontation with death.
Oh, I'm gonna double that up with the wife of Phocion, which is one of the mourners that I quoted at the beginning of the episode, because this woman, who's the widow of a statesman, a Greek statesman of Athens, who is considered a traitor. Well, he's this figure that first is great for Athens, and now they hate him for some reason. So they kill him by law, and the well part of the punishment is that he cannot be buried within the city of Athens. So his ashes, his body, and well, the ashes are his burning body and ashes are left just outside in the margins of civilization. And well, there is a famous painting by Poussin, which is also quoted in Morning Becomes the Law of Gillian Rose, which is where I'm extracting this from, where we see this huge, well, frame, this huge, ¿cómo se dice paisaje?
Landscape.
Okay, where we see this huge city landscape of Athens, and then in the first plane of the painting, we see these two tiny women doing something, and what they're doing is that, well, she might be eating the ashes of her husband.
Hmm.
What we see, because is the recovering of the ashes of Phocion. That's the name of the painting. So what she's doing is that since she cannot have a noble grave spot for him, she makes his grave spot her body.
Hmm. Wow.
And this also is important because um, in both psychoanalysis and in this interpretation of how mourning becomes the law, it has to do with giving a moment of this loss to enact itself in some way in your body. to
Mhm.
take possession of
Mhm.
your body. And afterwards, you will come, in terms of mourning becomes the law, if I understand it correctly, it has to do with, and after this losing of myself, I will recover myself, come back to the city state, and continue to work in the society. But I must lose myself. Otherwise, all of the other laws within the law will not be seen as just,
Mhm.
because I am not being considered. And in that term, that is one of the main topics for psychoanalysis in terms of grief. That pathological grief, for instance, has to do with the fact that in order to come to own yourself and to mature within your own self, one must acknowledge what possible losses occur, which, they begin with uttering the first word. When we utter the first word, we renounce to motherness. For instance, we must grieve this kind of the this narcotic state we lived in until now, which
Mhm.
is, you can't contain me wholly, I can now speak. And that is one of the first process of grieving. But if the self does not understand this, does not allow the loss to occur, then we are constantly representing this lost object without being able to regain this object in different, in the various ways it can come up to ourselves in life. And one of these ways in this process of mourning becoming the law is that my kin can also become the state kin,
Mhm.
the rest. I not only my not I do not mourn alone. Everybody mourns, every family can mourn. We are all, in the end, a web of mourners.
Mhm. It becomes like a social thing. And so poetry is also one of the melancholic ways of grieving our losses. And I'm going to read a poem to finish this episode by an Irish poet, Evan Boland. The reason I came across this poem was listening to one of my friends' podcasts. I'm going to announce two podcasts today. The first one is by Ben Colopy. He does Words That Burn. It's 15-minute episodes, and he read this poem. So if you want an analysis of this poem, look him up, Words That Burn. And the poem's called Amber. It never mattered that there was once a vast grieving, trees on their hillsides, in their groves, weeping, a plastic gold dropping through the seasons and centuries to the ground, until now. On this fine September afternoon from which you are absent, I am holding, as if my hand could store it, an ornament of amber you once gave me. Reason says this: the dead cannot see the living. The living will never see the dead again. The clean air we need to find each other in is gone forever. Yet, this resin once collected seeds, leaves, and even small feathers as it fell and fell, which now, in a sunny atmosphere, seem as alive as they ever were, as though the past could be present and memory itself, a Baltic honey, a chafing at the edges of the scene, a showing off of just how much can be kept safe inside a flawed translucence. And I chose this poem also because Andrea Celeste gave me a ring of amber that she brought from Czech Republic
Yeah.
like 15 years ago. So anyway,
And it lost a piece,
and it
right?
lost a piece, and I used to wear it around my neck every day, and now I don't because I don't want it to lose another piece. Keeping it. Okay, so that's it for today. One more thing, just to the other second podcast, and this also has to do with the wailing and the birds and the sirens and the relationship between the beasts and the humans and the human beasts, the animal and the human beasts. So the podcast I wanted to tell you about also is Animalistic by Kat Cray. She does 25, 30-minute episodes on the dynamics. She studies the dynamics, the relations between humans and animals. So if you want to check that out as well. And in our next episode, we're going to have a very special guest. We're going to do our first interview.
Yay!
And we are done with Dead for now. So hopefully
For now.
we can mourn the loss of the trilogy, of the Death trilogy that we've done, and move on to something else.
We are in Xochitl in Cuicatl. My name is Andrea Celeste.
My name is Andrea Martinez, and thank you for listening.